Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman here in the Oklahoman video studios. I'm Ben Felder. Joining me, the Political State crew, is Justin Wingeter, federal reporter, Dale Denwalt, Capitol reporter. And guys, a big election week. We've been talking about the elections, what to expect for months now, and we finally have results from the primary, a state question, some congressional races as well. Let's get into that, and let's start with, I don't know, depending on who you ask, it depends on what the biggest issue was. There was a state question, but let's start with the governor's race. I think we've talked most about that on previous shows, particularly on the GOP side. Several candidates. There was the top three: Lieutenant Governor Todd Lamb, former Oklahoma City Mayor Mick Cornett, Tulsa businessman Kevin Stitt, and that group of three got whittled down to two: Cornett and Stitt. Any surprises there?
Yeah, it was kind of a surprise. We all knew that someone had to go home at the end of the night, upset that they didn't get into the runoff, but I think hardly anyone would have expected that it would be Todd Lamb. Mm-hmm. He was the front runner. He's been the front runner for a couple of years, and assumed to be the governor in waiting, or at least the Republican nominee for governor in waiting. But Kevin Stitt entered the race. Mick Cornett entered the race, and they battled it out, up and down I-44 between here and Tulsa, and managed to pick up the most votes out of any of the governor candidates.
Yeah, and you say the front runner for the last several years. I mean, he was the first name that was mentioned.
That's right.
Years out from this race as a candidate for governor, and nobody thought that it was a guarantee that he would ultimately become the next governor. But you got to win the primary, you got to win an expected runoff, and then a general. But I don't think we expected him to stumble on that first test. And you're right, it was a competitive race. If you look at the map, I mean, Cornett did really well against around the Oklahoma City metro. Kevin did well around Tulsa. Was he just left without a urban base?
It seems to be that way. Someone pointed out the fact that if you look at the map of Lamb votes, Cornett votes, and Stitt votes, it kind of looks like the area code map in the state of Oklahoma. 405 went for Mick Cornett, 918, at least in the Tulsa area, went for Kevin Stitt, and then Todd Lamb managed to pick up the rest of the counties, which unfortunately not a lot of people live in those.
Yeah, well, I mean,
not enough.
And maybe we shouldn't be surprised, right? Because Lamb, out of all the candidates, was the quote-unquote kind of political insider. In a year and a time when there's a lot of frustration towards state government, we'll get into it a little bit later, incumbents that are, that were knocked out in the primaries, maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that the guy that's most closely connected with the Capitol is the one that voters decided, at least in the Republican primary, that they didn't want to see go through.
That's right. Thousands of people, you can't read their minds, but that has to be a play in at least a lot of them. You've got Todd Lamb, who's been a public figure for the last 8 years as lieutenant governor, and before that as a state senator. He had a massive war chest going into this election, a lot of political connections. He even had Donald Trump Jr. come to Oklahoma to stump for him, but in the end, it wasn't enough.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, Justin, what do you think going forward here? Now we've got Stitt and Cornett, an August 28th runoff. I think this is going to be a pretty contentious battle. I don't know how ugly it'll get, but it's going to be. I think a lot of people are expecting so far that it's going to be a pretty close race.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that map, because it is fascinating to look at, and it's fascinating going forward too, because you have the urban areas, but who gets the rest of that? Mm-hmm. That's organization. That takes structure. That takes the ability to have the call banks, the phone banks, the mailers, whatever it takes to get out there, because you're going to have to travel. You're going to have to meet people in the cafes and the coffee shops and whatever, the churches, because when you get in that rural area, it is tough to campaign and reach a lot of people in a day. Mm-hmm. And so that will be interesting. You have two more or less city boys and Cornett and Stitt there,
yeah,
in Oklahoma City and Tulsa respectively. And then the rest of the state, it's kind of up for grabs between them. So they're really going to have to travel, and that'll be interesting to see what they do to reach the rural voters.
A Republican primary in Oklahoma is very conservative. A Republican primary runoff probably gets a notch or two more conservative. Yes. Stitt seems to be the most conservative between the two. Cornett is always kind of pegged as more of a moderate. Do you feel like Stitt maybe has the advantage so far going into that? Just given what we are expecting the voter demographics to be.
I would think so. I would probably give him a slight edge at this point. I'm curious what Todd Lamb will do, if anything.
If he endorses anybody?
An endorsement would be enormous, but I don't know if he'll go that route or not.
Well, the rest of the field, Cornett was the most was the furthest left of all the candidates. I think we probably all agree on that, right?
Right.
Or Gary Jones.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So you have Cornette and Gary Jones. But so when you look at the rest of the field, minus maybe Gary Jones, you're looking at the rest of the field that's more conservative than Cornette. And I think you talk about where will Lamb go, but where will the voters for Lamb and the rest of the field go?
Yeah.
Because if you're, Dan Fisher, who actually picked up a county in southeast Oklahoma, ran on, abolishing abortion, Cornette refers to himself as pro-life. But hasn't been as forceful as Stitt has been in terms of saying, I'm going to appoint pro-life judges to the court. I'm going to work to abolish abortion. I mean, if you're a voter of Fisher and you look at the two candidates, and an abortion or other social issues is the most important thing to you, I got to think that Stitt is probably more appealing at this point.
That's right, and it comes down to how enthusiastic Mick Cornette voters are going to be in Oklahoma County, Cleveland County, the area. If he can manage to hold on to some of these voters who voted for him in this 405 area code, then he stands a really good chance of beating Kevin Stitt. He still has to pick up those rural areas, and I like what you said about the infrastructure of his campaign. There's July 4th weekend coming up. There's probably some county fairs coming up this summer over the next couple of months. If you expect to see governor candidates at these things, not necessarily the candidates themselves, but the campaign will have a booth with at least one volunteer. They got the T-shirt on, they got signs out, they have push cards, they've got stickers, whatever. You have to have that kind of outreach in the four corners of the state to be able to run a successful campaign, not just in the primary, but especially in the general.
Yeah.
And I assume that any candidate who's made it this far has some kind of infrastructure like that. So it remains to be seen.
Well, when you're listing all the things that make for a successful, organization and running a statewide campaign, I'm still thinking about Todd Lamb. I mean, he was, he had run a statewide campaign before. He liked to boast at how much he had traveled across the state, every county. Had a team in place that knew what they were doing. Not to say that the other two didn't, but I mean, organization does take you a long way, but only so far, maybe at the end of the day, right?
That's right. And some of the Lamb people may decide to start working for the gubernatorial nominee for the Republicans once we decide, or even now they may, since they find themselves out of a job, they may decide to go work for either Cornette or Stitt. Yeah.
Well, we've talked mostly about the Republican primary for governor because on the Democratic side, Drew Edmondson, from the very beginning seemed like he was a shoo-in to win this one, even without even really trying in terms of like advertising and spending a lot of money. He did, and of course as we get closer to November, we'll talk about his chances in general. We still need to find out who that final candidate is going to be for the Republicans. But I'm curious, if you're Drew Edmondson, who do you think he's rooting for to win the Republican primary in terms of who he thinks he may have the best chance against?
I think he'd probably like to go against someone like Kevin Stitt because you can define yourself. Drew Edmondson can cast himself so much differently from Kevin Stitt than he can Mick Cornette.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, you agree with that, Justin?
Definitely, absolutely.
I mean, I have heard some Democrats say that they like Cornette.
Sure.
I don't know that I've ever heard any Democrats say they like Stitt. I mean, your blue dog Democrats, they're still registered Democrats in some of the most conservative parts of the state. Yeah, I'm sure Stitt's going to get Democratic votes if he emerges onto the general. I don't mean that, but I mean your urban Democrats, your kind of progressive millennials. I've heard some say, I like Cornette, I'd be willing to support Cornette. So I think you're right. I mean, if it's Edmondson versus Cornette, he's probably, Edmondson may lose some votes against Cornette that he'd pick up if it was against it. So let's go down the ballot a little bit to the legislature. This was a big night because we saw several incumbents lose. We've talked about it before. In past elections, it's rare that you even see one incumbent lose. Let alone how many did we have on election night?
Five. 5 plus the Senate.
Yeah, 5 in the House, 1 in the Senate. I mean, we talked about the voter frustration. Was this surprising to see?
It wasn't surprising. I predicted that some incumbents would lose. Obviously, I didn't know the number, but I thought it would be more than 1 or 2. There's going to be 6 legislators not returning because voters picked somebody else. We also know that there are 10 legislators still fighting for their jobs with the runoff on August 28th. And so really it wasn't a surprise, and it was really, I think, a Republican revolt of lawmakers. Now, it would have been surprising if voters voted against the Republicans who raised taxes on them, like if that was a consideration. But in my reporting, I found that about half of the ones who were either voted out or go into a runoff were among those who didn't vote for the tax increase. So you've got legislators who did vote for the teacher pay, but who didn't vote for the tax increase. And I was talking to another legislator who said you can't have both. You know, and primary voters are smarter than that. You can't say that you're for teacher pay and then vote against the way that you're going to pay for that salary increase.
Yeah.
And I think that may have had a lot to do with it.
Yeah. You know, Justin, if I were to ask you about a year ago you came here, but you were in Kansas, so a pretty similar political landscape in a lot of ways, that there was going to be a wave of Republican lawmakers lose their primary, incumbents lose their primary because they refuse to raise taxes. I mean, that is a pretty bizarre thing to think about.
We've talked about it on the show so many times what an unusual change this has been in the state. And Senate District 40 to me was the shock of the evening. In some ways, I guess the Lamb losing is kind of, it's on a larger scale, so it's a shock for that reason. But Senator Yen losing in Senate District 40, which I happen to live in, maybe that's why I'm a little biased there, but I thought that was more surprising than anything. We had talked about that district in terms of who will the Democrat be. There's a very tight Democratic primary there, and hopes that, Democrats have hopes that they can flip that seat. I don't think there was much talk about Senator Yen losing his, and if I recall, it was not exactly a close loss.
Joe Howe, a vastly more conservative candidate than Yen. I mean, so this is a race where voters in the Republican primary, picked a more conservative person to be their nominee. Carrie Hicks, who won the Democratic nomination, a teacher, I talked to her the day after the election, and I was asking, well, do you feel like, how do your chances change now that you're not going up against an incumbent in November? And, she was saying, I don't know, we're still trying to get our head around that because we, since day one, assumed we'd be running against Senator Yen. So it definitely changes things in that, and, probably makes, I would imagine maybe gives the Democrats an even better chance, right? I mean, this is a moderate district, or trending towards a moderate. Now you've got an even more conservative candidate from the Republicans, going up against a battle-tested now public school teacher.
Yeah, it's obvious that Senator Yen didn't have a lot of support among Republicans in his House district, and if he was hoping to hold on to some moderate, independent, and maybe even a few Democratic votes heading into the general. Some of those may decide that Joe Howe isn't the person for them and decide to go to the Democrats. So, again, without a crystal ball, it's hard to say, but I think that there's probably some anxiety on the part of Democrats in this race and working on this race because, who is Joe Howe? What's his background? Have you done any opposition research on him?
Yeah.
They don't know who he is. The voters don't know who he is. It would have been easier to paint Yen as being, an incumbent, which he was obviously, and a Republican, and in a district that's trending. So it would have been very easy for Carrie Hicks to say, we know who Senator Yen is, this Republican, we need to get a Democrat in there, et cetera. It's a little harder with someone who's kind of unknown. So they have to play catch up a little bit, as Dale was talking about there. You would think ideologically it does make sense that it gets easier for Democrats now, but there are some complications in there too. It's not.
Well, yeah, and you got to figure out, how did he win? I mean, was this just were Republicans just tired of their incumbent? Did he have a pocket of support somewhere in the Senate? I mean, when you talk about these House and Senate races, now once again, Howe won by quite a big margin, but sometimes in these close upsets, the winner, you find out, well, maybe they belong to a church that had a pretty, kind of an energized base, there, or maybe he works at a business in the. I mean, sometimes they have these pockets of support that can really make a big difference, especially when there's low turnout elections. But we didn't see that this year. We saw pretty high turnout.
It was amazingly high turnout.
Yeah.
I think even more than the presidential primary 4 years ago.
Yeah. So voters engaged, and I want to go back to something you said. You said, voters are smart. And I think sometimes people don't, make that assumption about the electorate. But when it comes to a lot of these candidates who are these incumbents who said, I'm not raising taxes, that's not what my people in my district want. Well, a lot of those were wrong. They didn't make the best judgment of their constituents. Maybe it wasn't the constituents that they were trying to keep happy. But it also goes to show you that, yes, this is nothing's changed. This is an anti-tax state. I mean, we've talked about it before. Oklahoma is not going down the road of becoming a tax and spend state anytime soon. But the voters, I think, showed that, like, yes, we don't want to see our taxes raised, but when push comes to shove and we're facing a crisis, and people can disagree with this, but for most people will probably say that what we saw in education this year was a full-blown crisis, especially with the teacher walkout, that even the most conservative voters said, you know what, at some times you do have to bite the bullet and you have to make some investments. And some lawmakers, I guess, didn't go along with that and cost them their jobs.
That's right. And I think people will start to sort of forget the attitude as the further down the road we go. Oklahoma is not a tax-raising state for the most part. I think it's an isolated incident. And if you have candidates talking about raising taxes next year, they're going to get voted out of office.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. Well, we had some congressional races first, but let's first talk about the state question. That was another big one too. Medical marijuana passed by quite a big margin. So medical marijuana will become legal here in Oklahoma in a matter of a couple months, maybe a little bit longer. So now we have to wait on state government to actually determine what this is going to look like.
Bureaucracy is slow. If people were, I know that supporters of medical marijuana have been waiting a long time. Number one, to actually get on the ballot, and number two, for the actual election to take place. And now they're going to have to wait even a little bit longer to actually be able to use this new industry that's going to crop up in Oklahoma, because we went from illegal to legal overnight. There wasn't a whole lot that business could do to prepare, right? Someone wasn't growing marijuana in their backyard or in a greenhouse before, with the hopes that they could put it in their shop, because there's so much that's going to be checked between, from the seeds all the way to the plant to the retailer. It's all got to be run through the Bureau of Narcotics, State Department of Health, all that stuff. It's going to be watched closely. And so basically you start this week, or as soon as the licenses come out. And it's going to take a little bit, maybe as much as 12 months, could be 3 months. But it's going to take just a little bit of time to get the infrastructure in place, businesses set up, warehouses filled, plants to start growing before you can actually sell it.
Yeah. Well, all the talk before the election was that if this passes, the legislature has to come back for a special session to write some of these, regulations and such. Now we're hearing that maybe they don't come back for a special session.
Apparently, there's not a whole lot maybe the legislature wants to do. They've got 10 of their Republican members in a runoff, headed to a runoff August the 28th. And they may not want to endanger them by putting them in a special session where a lot of things can happen. They could also, just realize that the State Department of Health has come up with a lengthy list of new regulations. Maybe that covers all or most of it. Maybe the really critical stuff is covered in these new rules, and everything else can wait a few months until February when they come back in regular session.
It seemed like, maybe one of the reasons why the threat of a special session was there was because the opposition, the opponents to this question, kept saying, it's kind of the Wild West with medical marijuana. We've never seen a liberal medical marijuana, question like this. And so it was easy to say, well, lawmakers are going to have to come back and tighten things up and that kind of thing. But once we get on the other side of it, as you say, maybe lawmakers are saying, hey, maybe us meeting in the Capitol is not the best thing, especially in an election year. It's kind of risky. It's kind of like that old adage of, what do you pass or run? Well, if you pass the ball, 2 out of 3 outcomes can be bad for you: interception and incomplete pass. Maybe the leadership is thinking, this may not be good for us. Like you said, going into those runoffs. And who knows? Maybe the legislature gathers. I think we assume that maybe most of the Republican legislature was against this. I don't know if that's true or not. But maybe you have a group that wants to really regulate this to a point where it almost makes it, impossible. And that's now going against the will of the people, and then you're going in an election year, and it just becomes a messy thing. So it's meeting at the Capitol for the legislature is no guarantee of what's going to happen.
And you have a stable of Democrats who would probably vigorously vote against and debate against any change to the law as it is now. If you give those Democrats a vote, they're probably going to vote against it. For the most part, I think the Democratic caucus, at least in the House, support the state question as it is, with the regulations coming from the State Department of Health. And if you give them a chance, if you give the minority a chance to open their mouths, they're going to open it.
Yeah, especially going into an election year, they're trying to take advantage of anything that they can.
If they're not passing, are they running the ball? Are they taking a knee? I wasn't sure where you're going there.
Well, just
I picture halfback Charles McClaw running for 2 yards.
I don't think you're taking a knee, but just a clean run up the middle. Like let's just
you don't want to tackle Charles McClaw.
Whatever, yeah. Whatever. We saw a near tackle of McCall right earlier this year. But yeah, I just feel like if you're the legislature, you're thinking, there's a lot of reasons why. There are a lot of bad outcomes. Like if you think of all the scenarios of a special session, and let's say you come up with 10 outcomes, 7 of them won't be good for the Republicans. 3 might. So it's like, do you want to roll the dice on that? I mean, they still may be in a special session. There's just talk that they might not, and we'll see what the health department rules look like and that kind of thing. But I think when you saw such a wide margin of victory, I mean, this is a mandate. People want this. There's going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of resistance if the legislature tried to come back and rein in what the people approved with State Question 788. So we'll just have to wait to see there. And then also, before we end this episode, let's talk about the congressional races. It was a primary for them as well, and a lot of interest, especially on the Democratic side in the 5th Congressional District. Yeah,
I mean, as we talked on election night, Kendra Horn obviously having a good night, but failing to reach that 50+1. I was skeptical of her ability to do it anyway. I mean, 6 candidates. Many have been running for quite some time. Many had a pretty strong base. Even if they're it's Elizabeth Britt or Ed Porter getting 11, 12, 13%, that chips away at your ability to get 50+1. So Kendra Horn falls short there. One interesting number if you're a Democrat is that more people voted in the Democratic primary in CD5 than the Republican primary. Obviously, as our listeners know, there are 2 caveats there. Independents rather can vote in the Democratic primary and not in the Republican. Also, the Republican race was not competitive. Congressman Russell cruised a re-election. That was never really in doubt, so without a runoff. So there were a couple caveats there, but nonetheless, if you're a Democrat trying to get excited about this race, believing this seat can flip, as we've argued that it can here, then I think you get excited that Democrats outnumbered Republicans voting in the primary on Tuesday night.
Yeah, and one of the focuses in this race is that this district seems like the one that Democrats can win at some point, maybe not this year, maybe not the next cycle, but at some point the demographics are going to shift. If you go back, I believe I don't have the numbers in front of me, but during Obama's election, his two elections, the Democratic candidate in CD5 did worse than Obama did on the ballot. So that means you have people who voted for Obama in CD5 in 2008 and in 2012, I think it's right, who did not vote for the Democratic candidate for Congress. And usually you would want the presidential nominee to kind of be the baseline of your support and build on that.
Right.
And so there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe there weren't as strong candidates that were running in CD5 for the Democrats. But if you have a strong candidate going, I just feel like the gap between where Democrats have been and where they need to be is not as big as people may think. I mean, when you kind of look at that. Now, I'm not predicting that they're going to win this one. I think there's a lot of, we'll see what the national conversation looks like when we get into November. Now, Horn has to still kind of focus on a runoff instead of immediately turning her attention to Russell, although she has said as much that now she's running against Russell for the most part, right?
I think she's always kind of run this as if she's in the general election. I mean, she really feels, first of all, some things are not all that different. I mean, getting your name out there, going door to door, doing the flyers, the mailers, whatever, that's stuff you'd be doing regardless of who you're running against. I mean, it's just basic getting your name and platform out there.
But you're focusing on Democratic voters until you win that nomination as opposed to the electorate as a whole, right?
Right. But I mean, I just don't see a lot of differences there. But yeah, Democrats did miss an opportunity to coalesce around one candidate and set up a 5-month, one-on-one against Russell. That's just because there were so many of them, frankly. I mean, 6 candidates, it was just so difficult. But I mean, nonetheless, I mean, Horn, I think, goes into the runoff as a favorite. She did pretty well Tuesday night. short of 50+1, but certainly had a good night. So she goes into the runoff as a favorite. If she can get past that, then she just should be able to be pretty well suited to go against Russell one-on-one. But yeah, I mean, the congressman gets to go straight into general election mode, and Kendra Horn does not. She still has the runoff. So we'll see what happens. But,
yeah. And that not really too many surprises, right, across congressional races here in Oklahoma?
No, I mean, Democrats outnumbering Republicans also happened in the 2nd district, which is a very different district. This happens pretty often because that's a place where Democrats used to pretty much own the place in eastern Oklahoma out there. And that has changed, obviously, Markwayne Mullen's district. But it's kind of an odd district in terms of Democrats still have more registered voters than Republicans. So that one will be a race to keep an eye on. I was really watching the Republican side on Tuesday night, whether or not Mullen could avoid a runoff. He would not have wanted a dreaded runoff against a more conservative candidate, which almost certainly would have happened. But he was able to avoid that, even against 3 challengers. So, former Senator Coburn had backed one of his challengers. There was some conservative frustration towards Mullen. He broke a term limit pledge. And that was really the gist of the frustration. But he was nonetheless able to skip a runoff, and he should be well suited to most likely face Tahlequah Mayor Jason Nichols.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Coburn. I mean, in some ways, this election has represented kind of, solidifying the past changing of the guard a little bit, kind of in politics, or at least some groups, some individuals that used to have a lot of power, maybe not being quite as powerful. I mean, Coburn, his candidate not making it through, his effort to repeal the tax increases that funded teacher pay raises not going through. A lot of the kind of establishment businesses that get involved in politics put their support behind Lamb. I'm not saying that it's completely shifted, but some of the individuals, some of the groups and organizations that have traditionally had a lot of power in politics and kind of picked the winners, weren't quite as successful.
And that includes the Oklahoma Panhandle, the representative, the House seat out there. Colton Buckley was endorsed by Tom Coburn, came in 3rd.
Yeah, so
rough couple weeks for Tom Coburn, rough couple weeks for Pat McFerrin, Republican strategist here in Oklahoma City, who doesn't miss many. But
we're going to have to get him on and ask him about it.
Yeah. Well, that sounded like a challenge there. So Pat, if you're listening,
Pat,
we'll bring you on. We'll ask you about the elections and what you think going forward. So well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoma. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back for another episode next Friday and continue to cover as we run up to the runoff elections on August 28th. With Justin and Dale, I'm Ben. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.